Well, okay, this is Tuesday, August 17th. This is the California Avocado Society, California Avocado Commission, University of California Avocado Workshop. Today we're going to be talking about how to mediate, moderate, interpret the avocado to be able to sustain heat damage and improve fruit set. And our speakers today are me, Ben Faber from Cooperative Extension in Ventura, Santa Barbara, and Lu Arpaia, who's our post-harvest specialist, who's also in charge of the avocado breeding program at UC Riverside. Our sponsors today are Index Fresh, Westpac, Mission, Calavo, Delray Avocado, Westphalia Fruit, Nutrient Ag Solutions, American Ag Credit, AgriService, Wilbur Ellis Agribusiness, and Avotopia. So we thank those generous sponsors. I will be the first speaker, and I am actually going to interpret a presentation made by Lisa Fife from Australia. And the reason for that is these darn Australians have been dealing with heat modification much longer than we have, so for over 10 years. And Lisa Fife is a consultant in Australia. She works for a company, or she owns a company called Bright Horticulture. And one of the reasons why we asked for the experiences the Australians have had is that this area where they're growing, this is in the southern part or the northern part of what we would call California, but the southern part of Australia. And this is an area of Queensland, South Australia, New South Wales, which is the major avocado growing area. There's another area here on the west coast of Australia, around Perth, that they grow avocados as well. But this area has high soil pH, ranging from 6 to 9, high limestone, low organic matter content and carbon levels in the soil types that range from sandy loam to sandy clay loam, high salt presence, water availability even during regular years, but especially during drought years that they've been having. They've got high summer temperatures, 80 to 113 degrees, with low humidity. They've got cold temperatures, which are a little bit chillier than ours in the southern part of Australia. High winds in the spring, and temperature variability and fluctuation. So they will go from 60 degrees to 107 degrees in a few days. Now, this sounds a lot like Southern California, right? So this is one reason why sought their experience to see how we might improve heat tolerance in avocados here in our avocado growing areas in California. So what are the impacts of extreme heat? Well, you get flowers dropping, then fruit dropping, and you get a reduction in fruit size. And this is the reduced fruit size is largely because the photosynthesis is reduced. So the trees aren't manufacturing sugars to make fruit. And then something significant that we really haven't been remarking about is actual root death. And you can see the soil here is exposed without mulch, and the soil temperatures heat up and root death occurs. So how do you prevent heat damage? So these slides that have the blue are those that came from Lisa Fife, and you'll see some in here that don't have blue, and those are the ones that I've amended so that it's more customized to the California situation. Anyway, preventing heat damage. Well, you can change the environment, okay? And basically, we're going to talk about using water to cause misting and change temperature and humidity. Use protectants, and specifically they're talking about snow coat and surround, and maintaining good nutrition, so a healthier tree is capable of sustaining more heat stress than one that's losing a poor nutritional state. So the environment. So we're talking about manipulating the surrounding environment to improve the microclimate. And essentially this is managing water, using misting systems, but also looking at mulching, using windbreaks, what they call interrow cropping, and cover crops. So all of these are going to help modify that environment, make it cooler, make it more humid. And so something to remember is that a plant must lose water in order to grow. Okay, when the stomata close, they stop growing, and you end up with smaller fruit. So carbon dioxide comes in, and when the carbon dioxide's going in, it's creating an opening by which water is lost. So water must be lost in order for photosynthesis to occur. And in order for water to flow through the plant, for water to go from the soil, through the roots, through the stem, into the leaf, and out the leaf, in order to get carbon dioxide in, you have to have a leaf, and you have to have a stomata open. So this whole system is dependent on stomata. And here's those little tricky things that are called stomata. These are on the underside of the leaf of the avocado. And many other plants have got stomata that are all over the plant. Sometimes the stem, sometimes the tops of the leaves. But in the avocado tree, it's on the underside of the leaf. And so here's an open stomata, and on the right side, it's closed. And these will close when there's insufficient light. Okay? When leaves start shading each other, when the canopy becomes too dense, basically the stomata close. And at some point, when there's not adequate light, the leaf becomes non-functional and the leaf just drops off. These stomata close at high temperatures, and you'll see some information that Mary Lou presents that shows how at high temperature and high evaporative demand, you can have actually high evaporative demand that occurs when we have Santa Ana conditions. So it may be a cool Santa Ana, which is not very common, but when there's high evaporative demand, the stomata can close too. When the tree can't keep up with the evaporative demand, it will shut down its stomata to protect the leaf, essentially. So the stomata must be open for transpiration to occur. Transpiration is the cooling process by which the tree cools itself. So get evaporative cooling that occurs, and transpiration has to occur to prevent the plant from heating up. If the leaf heats up, sunburn occurs. So in order for the plant to maintain its temperature, it has to move water from the soil, through the roots, up through the stem, to the leaf, and then out the leaf. If the stomata close and the transpiration does not occur, the leaf heats up, you get sunburning of the leaf, get high temperatures on the leaf itself. In fact, the leaf can be at a higher temperature than the surrounding air. You get sunburn of the leaf as well as the fruit. So what about evapotranspiration? So we need to understand that sun is what drives water loss in the plant. So day length, the stomata respond to sunlight, and this is affected by the clouds and length of the day. So the longer the day, the fewer clouds, more transpiration. By wind, Santa Ana winds are really tough on trees, and they will often cause stomata to close and for transpiration to stop. Humidity, okay, the higher the humidity, the more transpiration, the less transpiration. So the drier the air, the more the transpiration. And temperature. And it turns out high temperatures are the least impactful on transpiration. The three main drivers of transpiration, evapotranspiration, are sunlight, wind, and humidity. Okay, low humidity high winds, lots of light, and lastly of all, temperature. Oftentimes it's temperature that humans respond to. It's hot, oh, well, if it's, there's no wind, if it's a short day, um, if you have high humidity, we have conditions along the coast where it can feel like Florida at times, because the humidity is so high. When the humidity is high, the transpiration is low. So, stomata close under light stress, water stress, and heat stress. And when temperatures exceed about 85 degrees, stomata will close. Trees, okay, this is lesson number 1. Trees need to be hydrated prior to a heat spell in order to keep stomata open. This is one of these feedback things where water stress trees can't respond to heat because their stomata close. When the stomata close, they start heating up and they go into heat stress itself. And a heat stress plant can't respond to the water demand. So when when it gets hot, the stomata close and they can't transpire and they can't cool themselves off. Mary Lou is going to be talking more about this, but she and Bob Heath at UC Riverside did some really interesting work on this. So basically, you need to irrigate when you know that Santa Ana conditions are coming, when you know that hot temperatures are coming. You need to irrigate the tree to make sure it's hydrated so that it can keep its stomata open when those stressful conditions come. Because once those stresses arrive, it just shuts down. Okay. So here is the experience of Australia. They found that increasing the humidity and reducing the heat. Okay, so you start using an overhead misting system, and the evaporation that occurs from that water that's been put out lowers the temperature, okay, and it increases the humidity. So these are two of the major functions that drive transpiration. If you can lower the temperature and raise the humidity, you're going to decrease the demand, the evaporative demand on the plant. And the amount of water that's being put out is a function of the sprinkler size. Okay, you want to, and that sprinkler size is going to be controlled by your irrigation system and the capacity and the reservoir capacity to deliver water. You need a large proportion of the area wetted. Okay, you need to create a mist in the orchard. You need to cover the whole orchard. Sprinklers need to be over the tree. They can't be inside the vegetation of the tree. They need to be turned on at about what they say is 93 degrees. So that's kind of the threshold at which these misting systems come on. The systems are dependent on water availability. So where there's not a large delivery capacity, where there's not a reservoir, or where there's not connection to district water that provides a lot of water, or a well that can provide a lot of water, they will either pulse it, go between irrigation blocks, or they'll pulse intermittently water that's going on to within an irrigation block. And they monitor temperature, air temperature, leaf temperature, the humidity within the orchard, and the wind. So they're looking at how the conditions are changing and adjusting the misting system according to those changes. And they found that depending on the wind speed, sprinkler output, and the temperatures, that they can drop orchard temperatures by 9 to 15 degrees. This is their experience. And this is how they have organized their misting systems. They use above canopy. These are metal pipes, galvanized pipe. There's one at every other tree, every other row. And this has become the standard. So you see that they've got actually 2 separate irrigation lines, or watering lines. They've got the line for the sprinklers to hydrate the trees, to keep them well watered. And then they've got a separate line where they can run water just for the misting system. So they're run independently. You can run them both at the same time if you've got the capacity, but uh, the misting system is the most critical for reducing uh, temperatures and raising humidities within the orchard. So based on that experience, there have been growers experimenting with these misting systems in California, um, two of which are growers in the Ventura area. One is in the Ojai area, and um, in the 2019 heat wave, where a lot of fruit was dropped, grower put in overhead system, and this is one where PVC pipe was used, and there is an overlap with this system. So this system is designed so that there is an overlap. It's on a different kind of grid pattern than the Australian system. And this was in 5 irrigation blocks. And the grower rotated, he didn't have the capacity to irrigate everything at the same time. So he rotated, he pulsed every 30 minutes, rotating through these 5 blocks. So this would run for a half hour, turn off, and this would run for a half hour, and so on. And he monitored air temperature. And air temperature and leaf temperature are not the same. Oftentimes, the leaf temperature will be higher than the air temperature. But in this case, he was monitoring air temperatures and found that when the air temperature was at 102 degrees, the air temperature at 2 different sites was about 10 degrees lower when the system was running. So he was getting comparable temperature declines that the Australians have found. So the system was installed in 2019 after this heat spell, where you can see the damage that was done. After the system was installed, there was no significant fruit drop, no significant adverse effects to the trees. He only had 6 emitters from trees, but this is a certain gallonage that's being put out that can still cover that whole irrigation block. And it costs about $1,000 an acre. And if you amortize this over a 10-year period, it's about $100 an acre to save what, $5,000, $8,000, $10,000 fruit. A neighbor of his put in a system in Santa Paula which was comparable. This was a system that was spaced every 60 by 60 feet, every 4th row. But it was, again, designed so that there was sprinkler overlap. So here is the system. Back here, you can see a spray. And this successfully lowered temperatures as well, so there is no significant fruit drop. Air temperatures at that site were 115 degrees last summer or last fall. And the grower is getting a 5 to 7 degree decrease in temperature, but he found no significant fruit drop, to the point where he's now installed a further system in his new orchard. And that cost is about the same. It's about $1,200 an acre. So these are successful systems that work in California and are relatively inexpensive. Now, this presentation was recorded and is available at the California Avocado Society seminars section. You can go to it and listen to this whole discussion. Julia Marino from UC Davis, tree physiologist, is talking in more detail about how temperature and heat affect tree physiology. And then we had a grower panel speaking about their experiences in installing overhead irrigation. There were 3 different growers with 3 very different methods, plus an apple grower from Washington State talking about the system that has been in use in Washington State for many years. They've had climate change up there that's affected apple production. they've successfully used overhead systems up to 20 years now. So one of the other things that the Australians emphasize, and we keep emphasizing here, is getting a handle on irrigation, making sure that the irrigation systems are working, that the sprinklers are putting out what you expect them to do, that the lines are clean, the pressures are correct, the systems are maintained, and they do soil moisture monitoring. In this case, they're using a lot of different systems. The Israelis use a lot of systems too. The Australians, rather, have been using a system called EnviroScan, which measures at 4 different depths, so they can actually see what's going on lower down. That's what's happening here, and near the surface, so that they'll monitor to make sure that the soils are fully wetted going into a heat spell or windy conditions. So they really emphasize mulch too. It reduces evaporation. It provides a barrier to reduce heat stress to the roots. It reduces root death. I don't know if we've actually looked at these temperatures and its impact on root health. Something we should look at. It improves the water holding capacity over time. Improves organic matter, which should impact root health, improving soil biology. As we all know, mulching is expensive. It's primarily the cost of applying it. And in Australia, they have pretty much flat ground. They do a lot of cover cropping, and then they mow it and shoot it into the tree rows. So that's a whole lot cheaper than bringing in a woody mulch and spreading it by hand. They really have seen an improvement in root health and reduced root depth by using mulch. And so this is typical of the mulch that we put out. You can see how it can insulate the soil in the immediate area of the roots. And so they found that with ambient air temperatures of 104 degrees, they actually will reduce the amount of reflection of radiation on the leaves, reducing leaf burn. But they've also found that at a 3-inch depth, if they don't mulch, they'll get 86 degrees, which will actually kill roots. So I think this would be an interesting area to look at, especially in young orchards where there's no leaf mulch that's the trees have made. Okay, so why do you want to reduce temperatures? They found that pollen viability is reduced when temperatures exceed 93 degrees. Pollen is distorted when temperatures get above 100 degrees. They damage the ability for fruit set to occur. The pollen tube growth is reduced. They found that actually by introducing pollinators, pollinizers, such as edronol, they have improved fruit set in half. Okay, another way of reducing temperature and raising humidity is by putting in cover crops and putting in hedgerows. They've even gone to the point of putting these cages around individual trees to reduce temperature, to shade the trees. These are windbreaks that are put around individual trees, but you can put in a windbreak. Here's an example of one that is an eucalyptus windbreak. So these reduce the wind, therefore reduce the evaporative demand. They've also found that if you put out an intercrop, and here's a case actually in in Ventura around Saticoy, where they put in sweet peas, and that crop is then harvested to sell in the farmers market. Here they're getting the cooling effect that comes from having something green out there that's transpiring, putting moisture in that raises humidity, which is going to then also decrease transpiration and evaporative demand. And here's an example of a nice thick mulch put out to cool soil temperatures. Another way of doing adding humidity to an environment is actually, we're looking at pollination gardens. This is an orchard near Saticoy where these are planted actually to attract pollinators to bring in bees and lacewings and other pollinators that can pollinate avocados. So using protectants, okay, the major protectants used are the sunscreen materials like Surround, material called Screen Duo. These are materials either kaolin clay or calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate's not recommended for our areas with high pHs already because that's lime and they raise the pH. These reflect the sunlight and therefore reduce the heat load on individual leaves, and they reflect light so the temperatures are lower. There's also anti-transpirants like Vapor Guard, Wilt Knot, and Anti-Stress 2000. And these actually reduce water loss by covering the stomata so that the stomata cannot transpire. So that actually is not a very good idea. Anti-transpirants will actually cause heat load to increase because the trees now can't transpire. So it's good to recognize the difference between these reflectants and the anti-transpirants. Okay? These reflect heat, they maintain the opening of the stomata, and they help cool a leaf, whereas the anti-transpirants will clog the stomata and actually cause it to be hotter. And then they make sure that trunks are painted with white latex paint to reduce sunburn damage. So this is what happens with that anti-transpirants. Okay? Here is a coleus plant, and it's fully transpiring. And the idea, if you use an anti-transpirant, you stop this water from coming out. So you reduce the humidity and you reduce the evaporative cooling. So anti-transpirants stop what's happening. And it's really difficult to find some decent data showing the effect of anti-transpirants and reflectance on the ability of trees to, and not just avocado trees, but all trees to sustain heat. And one of the best ones is this article that came out of South Africa several years ago, where they actually showed that anti-transpirants can increase fruit drop and fruit damage when anti-transpirants are used. So the best thing to deal with water stress is anticipate the stress and get the water on before the stress arrives. Hydrate the tree so that it continues to transpire going into the stress period and it cools itself. We need to distinguish between heat stress and water stress because it's really the heat stress that we're most concerned with when high winds or high temperatures arrive. You want to have the tree fully hydrated so that it does not go into water stress. When the tree is overwhelmed, when evaporative demand is so high that water stress does occur, the stomata do close, and that's when heat stress will then occur. Sunscreen and surround materials are the materials of choice. And we really need to talk to the packing house about using something like surround. It's hard to get this off the fruit when it does get on the fruit. So lastly, a healthy tree is better better able to withstand heat. So you need to maintain a good nutritional program, maintain a healthy root system. That goes without saying. You need to maintain the trees so that phytophthora is not an issue. And then there's all these other materials out there, seaweeds, amino acids. It's not really clear how that affects trees' ability to sustain heat. Maybe yes, maybe no. So in summary, you need to protect an avocado tree from heat events by, first of all, having the optimum irrigation setup and healthy trees. Successful irrigation is crucial for a productive orchard to maintain good fruit size. Remember, when the stomata close, there's less photosynthesis. Less photosynthesis leads to smaller fruit size. Irrigation systems are critical, both under canopy as well as the misting system. Mulching is very important. Monitoring soil moisture and air temperature are critical to deciding when to turn misting systems on. Use of reflectants is valuable. Cover cropping and using hedgerows. So these are all the Australian experience. It's helpful to learn from them what they are doing. And thank you, Lucify, for this information. So what happens when you don't have water? What are some of the drought strategies that we can use in avocado? The impacts of drought are, avocados are not adapted to hot, dry climates. They've got a shallow root system. They've got low salt tolerance. So what do? Well, you look at your grove. Where are areas that are affected by cold, by too much salinity, by high soil pH, where the bees aren't going, where there's high wind? Where do you have spots that are not producing very well? Look at the orchard and decide, is it worth putting water on that area? And get rid of those trees. Don't water them. If they're not producing, don't waste the water on those. You want to save the water. Avocado trees have a threshold. You either get enough water and produce well, or you don't get enough water and you don't produce very well. So you want to save water for the productive areas so that they can continue to produce well, and then forget about the areas that are not productive. So you want to look at the root rot infected trees, cut them down, save that water. You want to mulch. You want to save that mulch for areas that can justify the use of spreading the mulch. We know that mulch can reduce water evaporative loss by up to 25%. So it actually saves water in the end. But it's an expensive material for the farm. You want to get rid of sunblotch trees because the effect on fruit and its reduced salability. In wind-prone areas, you can keep the trees just as wind breaks, but you really don't want to expect much yield off those. It's best to possibly reduce application in those areas. Forget about the yield coming off and just think of them as wind breaks. If you've got big trees, it's time to stump them. That's going to save you water right away. You want to whitewash to reduce sunburn damage. You can cap the sprinklers. When you go into a drought period, this may be at the time that you finally do that thinning or that pruning that you wanted to do all along. When you do stump a tree, when you do scaffold a tree, reduce its size, you can reduce the amount of water, but gradually you need to start reapplying it. Thinning a grove, removing every other tree will reduce the total amount of water, not by half, but maybe by a third. And that way you can increase the water to the remaining trees to make sure that they are productive. Pruning, typically when you prune, you reduce the water demand. If you take a 30-foot tree and take it down to 8 or 10 feet, you're not going to reduce the transpiration by half. You'll reduce by about 20 to 30% of it. Now that is going to save water and put into a much more productive tree in the end. And then we've found that kaolin sprays, especially those on trees that are not producing right now, will reduce temperature, reduce transpiration as it reduces the leaf temperature. You need to set priorities, fix the irrigation systems, maintain those irrigation systems. It's amazing how few people actually get the irrigation monitoring program from the Resource Conservation District to come out and make tests and suggest adjustments. These are 3 systems that are both available in San Diego, and Ventura, Santa Barbara, and San Luis. And then know when those Santa Anas are coming in, irrigate the trees in advance. The Santa Anas are highly demanding of water, and you need to have these trees fully prepared to receive those winds so that they can continue to transpire through that stressful period. Climate changes here. Historically, we had many more days that where we had to run our orchard heaters and wind machines. So fewer days now. We have fewer days where we have freeze events, but in the last 2 years, we've had some major heat events above 100 degrees that have been catastrophic. 118 degrees is way too hot for any plant, not just avocados. So we need to be prepared for this change. And installing an overhead misting system can be very efficient, both cost of installation as well as maintaining. So how do you keep abreast of what's going on? Well, we've got our blog. It's put out every few days. Many of the topics that are covered on how do you create cooler environments, how do you reduce salt damage and increase salt leaching. So you can click on that website, or you can go to our newsletter that comes out quarterly, and there's a new one that's coming out here pretty soon. So stay abreast. So at this point, we have a lot of questions. From Norman Kachuk, how do we establish a ratio between irrigation effects on general tree hydration and the effects of misting on leaves on tree health? Can we reduce irrigation if misting is showing some amount of measurable effect on stomata functionality? You know, that's a good question. So just by cooling and raising humidity, you're going to maintain stomata control. The amount of water that's applied is in the range of, when you're irrigating, you're applying something on the order of 1,000 gallons per acre per hour. These misting systems are designed to put out something much less than that, something more on the range of 100 gallons per hour per acre. So you're not really meeting the irrigation demand, but you are changing the temperature so that the evaporative demand, the transpirational demand is reduced. So you don't want to really think of the misting system as an irrigation system. It's a cooling system. So you're not really putting on enough water to really meet the irrigation needs, okay? Are different cover crops more effective than others? Yeah, a cover crop. You know, I used to think we only wanted to look at winter cover crops that were established with rainfall, the rainfall that we never get any longer. And now when I've seen this data that's coming out of Australia, where you can get significant cooling effects from a cover crop, you know, I think you can justify the water using a summer cover crop. And in this case, you might want to look at a perennial cover like New Zealand white clover. So you'll get a little bit of nitrogen from that. But you know, they kind of grow when they're wet And if you want to let them die back in a drought when it's not so hot, you can let them die back. So in that sense, you can manipulate that cover crop so that it's functional when you need it when the temperatures are high. That kind of goes dormant when other times when it won't use water. So I think we need to explore summer cover crops more than we used to. We also used to be terribly afraid of because of the lower temperatures that happen in the wintertime with a cover crop. They insulate both winter and summer and can make an orchard colder in the wintertime. But we're dealing with fewer cold winters now. So do some cover crops have higher transpiration rates? Yeah, anything that grows that is opening its stomata is going to be transpiring. And so anything that shuts down is not going to be transpiring. So that's really the difference. So, if you look at lettuce, a rutabaga, a lemon tree, an avocado tree, and the stomata are open, they're all losing water at a similar rate. It's driven by sun, wind, humidity, and temperature. Those are the driving factors. And unless you're a desert plant that just shuts down and controls things, most of the things that we grow are transpiring when they're growing. Okay, so if you want it to grow, you have to lose water. So I'm starting to think that maybe something like a clover that shuts down when you don't want to use it is a good idea, and then it pops up when you want it to do temperature control. So maybe that's what I'm not sure. Is there a quality criteria for misting water that's different from that for irrigation? Yes, you want to use high quality, anything that's touching those leaves, you want to be a high quality water, because growers have looked at misting systems, continuous misting systems. I know this happened with George Emmerich down in San Diego. He defoliated his trees because the salt in the water was deposited on the leaves and eventually dropped the leaves. These misting systems are designed to be run during these critical heat events. So you're running them 6 or 8 or 10 times during the year. And so the water quality is not as critical, but if you're running these for long periods of time, many, many times, the water quality does become very important. And so the experience in Australia as well as here in California is, if you're going to run it for a lot of times, it's got to be high quality. Using wastewater that has high salinity can be okay, again, if the frequency of application is limited to just a few times during summer. Or, we're getting these heat spells in the fall too. Is there an example of how to install a misting system? Yes, go to the Avocado Society seminar section from the June section, and there is a good description there of how to install misting systems. From Jane, do you need an overhead sprinkler close to the coast where the humidity is higher? Does it make sense in Ojai, Santa Paula, Fillmore, but coast and Carver? So talk to somebody in Carpinteria from last summer or 2 summers ago. It got hot. So, these were ideal. These were heaven on earth for avocados. But even though it's high humidity, it still gets hot and it gets windy. So, yeah, you can justify it. When temperatures, again, exceed, Mary Lou is going to talk more about this, but when temperatures start exceeding 85 degrees, 90 degrees, the trees shut down. Definitely you're starting to get heat damage to the leaf when temperatures get above 95 degrees. You'll get defoliation when the trees start getting to 110 degrees. And those temperatures happened in Carpinteria. So if you can tell me what the weather is going to be like tomorrow, I can tell you, yes, definitely you need to put in a misting system. But I think, it's a cost of $1,000 per acre, spread over 10 years, you can justify it. And Bob Shar, do you say that very high humidities affect the stomata also? Yes, high humidity reduces the transpiration. It's when it's dry, you've got this gradient. So, water moves to where it's dry. So when it's high humidity, it's like we don't transpire. When we sweat when it's high humidity. When you're in Florida, it feels miserable, but you're not evaporating water, so you're not cooling yourself. But generally speaking, in our condition, when we have higher humidities, transpirational demand is lower, and that's good. Okay, that's it. From Norman, because of water costs, it would be nice if we could reduce irrigation if misting is supplying. Yeah, you don't think of misting as an irrigation system. An irrigation system is below the canopy, and that's what's putting on most water. John Cornell, some of us don't have enough water to operate both the traditional as well as a misting system. So if you have to choose between water to the roots and water to the leaves of the misting system, that's exactly why you've got two separate systems. When the heat spell arrives, the roots are not very efficient at taking up water. You need to use the misting system to cool the system to keep transpiration going. So you want to go into it with the water onto the soil with the irrigation system, and then rely on the misting system when the heat spell, when the wind spell arrives, to cool, to raise the humidity to reduce transpirational load. So you're operating, you go into the system, you go into the stress period with wet soil using the irrigation system, and then you rely on the misting system to keep it cool. Now, if you've got enough water to run both at the same time, do that, as long as you don't create conditions that are going to be good for Phytophthora. From Derek, why do you roll over the concentrate calcium carbonate? Oh, I don't encourage calcium carbonate as a reflectant because calcium carbonate is lime and it raises pH. Now you're only putting on about 100 pounds per acre, but over time you're going to raise the pH. The kaolin clay is a neutral material; it's not going to affect pH, so that's why. Pure shade diffusion at 1 gallon per acre is applied at a fraction of the soil weight with the high liming rates. So yeah, they also seem to wash off easier. So if you can put on pure shade diffusion, I don't know that product. I'm scared. I'm scared of lime. So you're hearing my fears. But yeah, if you can put it on just 1 to 5 gallons per acre, that's not going to affect the soil pH. So thank you, Derek, for that advice. From Tom Brand, does higher humidity increase pests? Okay, we don't live in Florida, and you're not running these systems to be like Florida. So you're only going to be running these systems for 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 days max per year. So it may clean off the leaves, so you have fewer pests, right? So I don't know. So, but it's certainly not going to be a major issue of creating more pests. Thank you. I'll move to James. How important is spray? The spray coverage. Oh, under a tree. So again, you're using the overhead misting system, and you need that to have good coverage, a good pattern that you want to have overlap. So you're not using your under canopy irrigation system to cool. It will do some, but you're going to get more from a misting system. So with the under canopy irrigation system, with our micro sprinkler, you're only going to be creating slight humidity increase. You're not going to dropping temperatures very much. But having said that, whenever you walk into an orchard and the sprinklers are going, it's always cooler. From Jim Chitla, I set up an overhead cooling system just recently. If anyone wants to check it out here, in Duluth. You're welcome to see it. Thank you, Jim. Yes, people need to see it and kick it and see how it works. Thank you. Want to put out your information, maybe we can post it, phone number or email address. John Cornell, Gary Bender did some work many years ago where he showed that spraying water alone increased fruit set. Would you support the idea of using an overhead watering during the pollination time frame? You know, that's certainly the experience that they've had in Australia. By lowering temperatures, you increase pollen viability, you increase pollen tube growth. So, you know, the problem with our trees is it's hard to figure out when to run the system. When is fruit set occurring? You know, we need 48 hours of above 55 degrees to get fruit set occurring. You know, you're asking these questions that I'm sure have really good answers to, but I don't know what the answers are. And so this is something that we would need to look at, you know, running a misting system during pollination period. Okay, with that, why don't we take a break and get ready for Mary Lu Arpaia and see what she has to. Well, it's 10 o'clock. Why don't you fly? This is Dr. Mary Lu Arpaia from UC Riverside, currently residing at Visalia, so she can be close to Kearney Ag Center Research and Extension Center where she can do her work. So take it, Mary Lu.
Thank you, Ben. So I was I'm trying to get, there we are. I was tasked with the job of talking to you about light and the role of light in productivity of avocados. So that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to take a little bit of I'm going to talk about a lot of the things that Ben just talked about from the presentation in Australia, but I'm going to put it in an avocado light with a little data and also from a perspective of light. So my main focus in this presentation is to talk about light, but you'll see that everything is interlinked. So I really like this slide that I got from Bob Heath many years ago, and because he liked the analogy, and I think it's really true, that we need to look at our individual trees as little factories. And so we have a lot of inputs that go into the factory. We have light, we have carbon dioxide from the air, temperature, water, plant nutrition. The labor is provided by really the process of photosynthesis. I'll talk upon that. And the final outcome is the fruit. And so if we think about the tree as a factory, then we need to think about how do we have an efficient factory versus a factory that isn't very efficient. And so, you know, one of the things is the factory, if you have a lot of avocado root rot, root health that's not good, that's a major problem for the efficiency of the factory. So the tree is providing the labor and the output is the fruit. So the tree is the heart of the operation, and for successful management, you have all these different components. You have shoot growth, root growth, flowering fruit growth, immature fruit drop, and mature fruit drop. So we're not going to really talk about these things today, but these all go into that gigantic package that we're talking about today in terms of making sure that the tree is doing what it's supposed to be doing. So when we think about the tree, and it really the assembly line or the critical control point in the tree is photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is all about light. Okay, so when I talk about photosynthesis, I'm really talking about light. And I'm going to try to explain why photosynthesis is so important. It's just not this abstract process that occurs in the tree that we've heard about. It's key. It's absolutely key to productivity, producing fruit. And so we're going to talk about that today. So what is photosynthesis? Well, plants, including avocados, they make carbohydrates out of carbon dioxide. So the leaves, which is where photosynthesis takes place, takes up carbon dioxide from the air and water from the roots, and a few minerals like magnesium, because that is a key component of chlorophyll, which makes the trees green. So you have this system, and they do this with the aid of light, and that's why light is so important. And this process is called photosynthesis, which means putting together with light. So you take carbon dioxide and water and energy from the sun, which is the light, and the very first product of photosynthesis is a molecule of glucose, and a molecule of oxygen is given off. That's why, you know, they talk about we have to maintain the forests for controlling greenhouse emission, because the trees are giving off oxygen when they go through the process, this very first Calvin cycle, which is the very first step in all this plant metabolism that takes place. So the glucose then goes on and is utilized in the plant for many, many different functions. And glucose is a very simple 6-carbon carbohydrate, and they're composed of the elements of water and carbon. So their basic formula approximates this CH2O. Okay, so a molecule of glucose has 6 of these units in it. All carbohydrates are polar, and the low molecular forms of carbohydrates. So you have very complex carbohydrates like cellulose and starch, but when they're in the simplest form, they're known as sugars. And sugars are freely soluble in the water, so they can move around the plant very easily, usually in the phloem. They will move around in the plant. And most of the carbohydrates in plants are based on glucose and other 6-carbon sugars, like fructose and other sugars. Now, in avocados, then, the avocados is a little bit different, because besides producing glucose, fructose, and sucrose, the avocado produces 7 carbon sugars. So you have that H2O, instead of having 6 units, you have 7 units. And we have data, I've talked to you about this before, is that these 7 carbon sugars actually end up being the predominant sugars in the tree. So instead of glucose, fructose, and sucrose is a disaccharide made up of a glucose and fructose unit. The main sugars or carbohydrates in avocados are these 7 carbon sugars, D-manniheptulose and persayetol. And persayetol is very closely related to D-manniheptulose. It is a sugar alcohol, and we know that it's phloem mobile. And some of the work that was done in New Zealand shows that persayetol binds to boron, and boron moves it around the plant. In other tree crops, sorbitol, which is a 6-carbon sugar alcohol, binds the boron and moves around the plant. So the avocado is just unusual that it's using 7 carbon sugars rather than 6 carbon sugars. Why it ever did this, we don't know. We don't know what the evolutionary significance of this is. We looked at other members of the Lauraceae. They don't have the 7 carbon sugars, at least not in great detectable levels. And so the avocado seems to be a little bit unusual, but why, we don't know. So where does photosynthesis take place? So if we think about the avocado tree being a factory, the leaves are the assembly line. This is where it all happens, is in the leaves. Photosynthesis takes place in the leaves. And I just, looking at this picture now, I realize this poor leaf has perseamite on it, but even though it has perseamite, it's still photosynthesizing. And so Ben talked about stomates, and these are actual pictures of an avocado leaf. So in that upper leaf surface, you can see it looks like waves of water, at least when I look at it, and that's the upper leaf surface. And the leaf surface is covered by what they call epicuticular wax, and there are no stomates on the upper surface of the avocado leaf. So you just see wax and those things that look like little snakes. Those are trichomes. Now, if we turn the leaf over, that's what you see in the upper right-hand corner. You see that this is where the stomates are. And so I don't know if, can you see my pointer, Ben, when I point to it? Or is that just me being able to see it?
I
If
can, oh, yeah.
Okay.
There.
Okay, so here's a stomate, here's a stomate, here's another trichome or hair on the bottom of the leaf. This is a vein on the leaf. Whoops, sorry. This is a vein on the leaf. But you can see all these little things here. Those are the stomates. And if we look at a close-up, here is a stomate on the bottom of a Hass avocado leaf. So you can see it's covered with very thick layer of wax. And here's the stomate. And this stomate is actually open, partially open, so that it can have a gas exchange and release water vapor from the leaf surface. Okay, so if we go back up to this upper right-hand corner, here is an open stomate. You can see that stomate is wide open, but yet we have some other ones that are closed. So the stomates are active. They have this donut around it. It's called the guard cell. And one reason potassium nutrition is so important in avocados and other plants is that potassium is what regulates the opening and closing of what we call the guard cells. So here's another cross section of a leaf. And this leaf is like an avocado because it doesn't have any stomates up on the top. And here are the stomates down below. And the stomates are very important because they allow carbon dioxide to move into the leaf, and they allow water vapor to move out of the leaf. And this is it's very complicated. And here we have the guard cells. We have what they call the air boundary layer, which is a very thin layer that's of very still air that is around the leaf. And air movement or wind can affect the thickness of the boundary layer. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. So the stomates basically control water loss through transpiration, the water vapor moving out of the leaf, and carbon dioxide uptake, which is the beginning point of photosynthesis. And the photosynthesis then takes place in the mesophyll cells and these palisade layer cells, which are all contain chlorophyll. And the chlorophyll is what gives you the structure for photosynthesis. So the stomate is regulated. Here's an open and a closed one on the bottom of a Hass avocado leaf. So just to say the carbon dioxide comes into the leaf, and it is assimilated by the leaf by the process of photosynthesis. And that leads to carbohydrate and ultimately to oil production in the fruit. In water, the water vapor is released into the air through the process of transpiration. And that, as Ben talked about in his talk, provides a certain amount of cooling to the tree. So you can think of it as evaporative cooling. But it also allows nutrient movement into throughout the tree. So calcium is a very good example. Calcium is taken up by the roots and it moves in the xylem, which is the tubes that go up the vascular system, and the calcium moves into wherever the growing points are. But that is drawn, it's like a tube under pressure. That water moves up when the stomates are open. So that's why an anti-transpirant that causes the stomates to close is not also necessarily a good thing if you want to be moving nutritionals and other materials in the xylem to different points of the tree. So carbon dioxide going in, light drives photosynthesis in the chloroplast, which is and we have water moving from the roots through the tree. And you need the water to make the carbohydrates and to release oxygen also when you have the water vapor release. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense, I hope. And this is just, again, a schematic. Why do we care? Because you have water taken up by the roots, it moves up through the xylem, and then it goes out of the leaf through the process of transpiration. And that also helps drive the photosynthesis. So you need both of those occurring to really have the tree photosynthesizing and making carbohydrates for us, which drives tree growth and fruit growth. So we talk about, one thing we talk about is stomatal conductance. And stomatal conductance is a measurement of how open those stomates are. So are they open just a little teeny tiny bit, or are they open a lot? And so this is data that Bob Heath collected on Hass avocado. So here is the rate of photosynthesis, and this is stomatal conductance, or how open those stomates are on the bottom of the leaf. And you can see that the photosynthetic rate of the Hass avocado leaf increases as how large or how big those openings are in the stomates. Okay, so it's a dynamic process. It takes a lot of time. So when there's no light, the stomates close. So at night, the stomates are closed. And as the sun comes up in the morning and as the sun hits the leaves, the stomates begin to open. Now, this is some other data. This is stomatal conductance again. And on the x-axis on these three panels is the time of day. And so this is data that was collected down in Deleuze Canyon of Hass on Duke 7 over several days, but this is all the same day. And what you see is on this particular day, when it was about 14 degrees Celsius in the morning, which is it was a cool morning, it was about 60 degrees. We reach peak stomatal conductance, how open the stomates are, about 10 o'clock in the morning. And then the stomates begin to close as the temperature of the day begins to warm up. And I'll come back to the role of temperature. But you can see that the time of day influences how the stomates being open. There's differences between the trees. You can see this tree is 86% open compared to this tree that the stomates only open 68%. Maybe that has to do with root health. Maybe it has to do with the orientation of the tree on the slope. And it never reaches 100%. So that's something you have to bear in mind, that our factory is not 100% efficient, basically. And so the rate of photosynthesis varies and is not at maximal rate through the entire day. So you can see they're closed in the beginning, and when the sun comes up at sunrise, they begin to open, they reach a peak, and then they begin to close again. And then by the time that the sun sets in the afternoon, they're closed. So the factors that influence photosynthesis besides the presence and absence of light is the age of the leaf, light, temperature, humidity, wind, and water status of the tree. And I'm just going to briefly touch upon these because I want to show you that everything is a very integrated system. You can't talk about one without talking about the others. So as we know, avocados have growth flushes. And we also know that the growth flushes, especially the summer flush, is influenced by how big the crop is on the tree. So when you have a lot of fruit on the tree, when you're in a definitely heavy crop, that summer flush is reduced. Whereas when you're carrying a light crop on the tree, you have a larger summer flush. So the question really is, do leaves control productivity, and how do they do it? So we know that the leaves aren't always growing. We have these flushes. And we know that the summer flush is very important. The work that Carol Lovett did and the work that Rodrigo Iturrita did as part of his PhD as well shows that this summer flush is really, really important to contributing to next year's flowers. Okay, so if you go back and you look at some of the work that Carol has done in particular, it's very clear. But the leaves are also important for the photosynthesis. So not all leaves are created equal. So when you first see that flush and the hats, when the leaves are sort of reddish or copper brown, they are actually not photosynthesizing. And if we look on the right-hand panel, if we're thinking about chlorophyll, because chlorophyll is what causes, is where all the action happens in terms of the chloroplast. And for photosynthesis, the leaves do not become a net, they begin to start photosynthesizing when they're red bronze, but they don't reach maximum photosynthetic activity until they are dark green. Okay, so when you go out and you look at your leaves and the leaves are flushing, that's great because that's producing structure for the tree and future carbohydrates. But these leaves are not net photosynthesizers at this point in time. It's still these dark green leaves that are producing the carbohydrates that fuel the growth and of the tree and of the fruit. And the carbohydrate status of the tree varies in the leaf, varies with age. So if we look at here where the 0 is right here in the middle, this is when the leaf is about 50% of its maximum leaf size, which is somewhere between this bronze green and dark green state. And this is, if we look at the sugars, then here the blue line is sucrose. So you can see that until the leaf gets to be about 50% of its maximum fruit size, there is very low levels of sucrose and the 7-carbon sugar mannaheptulose in the leaf, which are products of photosynthesis. But the leaf has very high levels of this sugar alcohol, perseitol. And that's because perseitol is moving in the phloem tissue of the tree, and it's being imported into the developing leaf to help it grow. I hope that makes sense. So when we have a strong vegetative flush, when the trees are flowering and early fruit growth, then the leaves are competing with the fruit to get these products of photosynthesis. That's basically what I'm trying to tell you. So where does light come in? Avocados reach what we call light saturation point at about 1/4 to 1/3 full sunlight. So that basically is as light is increasing in intensity, you have an increase in the amount of photosynthesis, but it reaches a point where it levels off. And this for avocados ends up being about 1/4 to 1/3 full sunlight. And when you think about where the avocado tree comes from, that makes a lot of sense because the other avocado tree is an understory tree in temperate and subtropical rainforests. Okay, so that makes point that they're going to make the most out of a little bit, basically. It's another way to look at it. Okay? But the avocado tree, the leaves, the ability of the leaves to have photosynthesis is also reduced when you have leaves further and further into the tree. And I'm going to show you some data about that in a little bit as well. So how about temperature? Temperature in avocados, the photosynthesis is reduced at very high temperatures. And so that's why this evaporative cooling idea is really actually a great idea, especially in hot, dry areas where we have very hot and dry temperatures. Because what you see here, this red line, this is for Hass. This is data generated by Mike Mickelbart. You can see that the Hass leaf reaches actually optimum photosynthesis around 75 degrees. Now, how often do we really have 75 degrees? Not very often in Southern California. And by the time that you get to around 33 to 35 degrees, and this is in the 90s, you can see that photosynthesis is actually greatly reduced. Okay, so now if we can do evaporative cooling and we can keep the photosynthetic machinery operating, maybe that curve will go like this. It'll be still reduced, but it'll go like this. And remember now, the products of photosynthesis is what's going to drive fruit growth, flowering, and fruit set. And so we want to maintain the operation of photosynthesis as much as possible. Temperature during the day. This is some data that was collected by Xuan Lu at South Coast. And here again, you can see here's a cool day and a hot day. So the cool day was 80 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. This data was collected in in April. And here is a hot day where it was 95 to 100 degrees. So the bottom panel here is that you can see that the leaf temperature is always a little bit warmer than the air temperature. And that is because of what we call the boundary layer. Okay, so on a very hot day, the leaf temperature can actually get up over 100 degrees when the air temperature is maybe around in the mid 90s. So that's one thing to bear in mind. Here is a change in light during the day in the middle panel. So on this very first day, there was some clouds. It took a while for the light to become to saturation point for avocados, but on this very warm day, there wasn't very many clouds. Now, if we look at the rate of photosynthesis, you can see that the rate of photosynthesis on the cool day reaches its peak around midday on this particular day and then declines, but it doesn't decline as dramatically on this very warm day where we had good light early in the morning, the trees were photosynthesizing, we get to this very high temperature, and what do you see? A rapid drop off in the rate of photosynthesis of the trees. So I mentioned wind. Now I'm not talking Santa Ana wind. I'm talking very low movement of air around the trees, but that gives rise to what we call the boundary layer. And the boundary layer increases with very low air movement. And by having the thicker boundary layer, you're limiting the rate of photosynthesis because you slow the rate of transpiration. Transpiration and photosynthesis are linked. So if there's low transpiration, low movement of the water in the tree, then the rate of photosynthesis is also reduced. You can see it's a very complex dance that the tree is doing all the time. And air movement around the leaves, increasing that boundary layer, is also important for cooling of the leaves. Okay, so this is data that Bob Heath collected with an infrared camera. This is old data, actually. This data is now almost 15, 20 years old. But here he went out with an infrared camera and he took a picture of a leaf out. This was a grove out in Duluth. And you can see that the temperature of the leaf is 31 degrees Celsius, which is right around 88 degrees. Okay, so we're right at the maximum in which you're going to be seeing a big reduction in the photosynthetic rate of the leaves. Just with a little bit of wind, he used 2.5 meters per second, which is about 3 miles per hour. For 1.5 minutes, you can see the temperature of that leaf drop down below 85 degrees. So very, very good. He turned the wind off. He was using a fan at the time. And again, the temperature climbs back up to 31 degrees Celsius or about 88 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so it is because with the wind, he's affecting the thickness of this boundary layer and the ability of the leaf to transpire. So water stress, as you increase water stress in this graph, which is on the x-axis, you see that the rate of photosynthesis reaches a certain point, and then you have a dramatic drop in photosynthesis. Now, this is interesting because this shows that the Fuerte avocado is actually more stress sensitive to water stress than the Hass. And I don't have a graph for it, but we have data like for lamb Hass, and lamb Hass seems to be at another level higher than Hass. So it's a little bit more water stress tolerant than has. So there are differences between avocado varieties, not well characterized. We're working with a researcher from Chapman University this summer, actually, and she's looking at water movement in a number of different avocado varieties. So hopefully we'll have a graph that we can show different avocado varieties in relationship to water stress here in the near future. But the bottom line is that leaf water stress reduces photosynthesis, again, because the stomates will close when the tree is under water stress, and therefore the rate of photosynthesis declines. Water movement in the tree is also influenced by both light as well. So in this graph, this is data again collected by Bob Heath. He went out into Duluth. These are Hass trees on Duke 7, and he measured sap flow. So sap flow is you put these thermistors on the branches of the tree, and you can measure it actually by the impulse that goes through the sleeve. You can calculate how much water is moving in the branch. So these are 2 different days, and you can see the red line is the east side of the tree, true east, that saw the sunrise, and the blue line is the west side of the tree. So this is individual trees, but what you see is that because the tree sees the sun in the morning on the east side, it sees the sun in the afternoon on the west side, you can see that light is also playing a role in driving the water movement within the tree. So they're all interrelated. So, you know, you're thinking, okay, these are all little pieces of data that you've showed me, but, you know, I'm really interested in how do I manage all of this in my grove? And so that is how I want to spend the rest of this talk, is talking a little bit about canopy management, maximizing light into the tree. But we need to step back a little bit again, and I'm going to for a few additional slides. So the canopy is the whole tree, okay? And the canopy is the structure of the tree that is involved as a whole holistic factory for growth, reproduction, and survival of the tree. And somehow, you know, the canopy may not be designed for the best outcome from a commercial perspective. And so the avocado tree inherently is a very large tree, is an understory tree, is used to growing without very much light and not necessarily very productive in its wild habitat. We also know, I showed you the slide again, is that the tree growth cycles vary across time and are also influenced by crop load. So we need to step back. So we look at the whole tree, or the canopy of the tree, and it really is a collection of shoots. Okay, and the shoot characteristics are influenced by the presence of fruit, by the relative position of the shoot on the tree. Is it interior, outside? Is it on the east side of the tree, on the north side of the tree? And by how much light that particular shoot intercepts. So fruit effects on vegetative growth is really, really important. And this was the basis of Rodrigo's PhD thesis. So he found out that on Hass, 70% of all the fruit and shoots only had one vegetative flush. And that's what's shown here on the right. Here's a shoot that had a fruit on it. And you can see that it only had basically a spring flush. And this spring flush actually was relatively short. And only 8.5% of all the fruit and shoots, which were several hundred that he followed over multiple trees, ever had a lateral branch. Okay, so 70% of a shooting branch on fruit and shoots on a Hass only has one vegetative flush, and you need this vegetative flush to give rise to more vegetative growth and fruiting and flowering the following year. And only 8.5% of those that had the vegetative flush ever grew a lateral shoot. So non-fruiting shoot complexity is much more complex. So if you go out, go out and look at in your grove, and you'll see this very clearly, that if you have a non-fruiting shoot, it's much more complex than the shoot that has a fruit on it. And it's these very complex non-fruiting shoots that give rise to the flowering that we have the following year. Okay, so you always have a balance. And so if you go and look at the older literature, where you look at the writing of Tony Wiley, you look at the writing of Nigel Wolstenholme from South Africa, and you go on Avocado Source, you'll see there's this big discussion about how you have to balance the vegetative growth with the fruiting growth, the fruiting, because you need this growth to give rise to the flowers for next year. Now, it's not all bad news if you have a fruiting shoot. That typically these are born on the inside of the tree. The flowers are born on the outside of the tree in the spring, but as the fruit grows, that weight pulls that shoot into the interior of the tree, and so that spring flush is very short. But if you find fruiting shoots that are exposed to the sun on the exterior of the tree, then what happens is that you can get fruiting shoots that will have multiple growth flushes and actually have branching. So the exposure to light increases the complexity of both non-fruiting and fruiting shoots. And if a fruiting shoot is exposed to light, it will have additional growth flushes, which is a good thing. It will have increased branching, so increased complexity, and it has a higher probability of flowering and bearing fruit again. Okay, so light is crucial in all of this. So this is looking at the tree as a group of shoot. The tree is composed of shoots, and the shoots have these different characteristics. They're either fruiting, non-fruiting, they're either complex or very simple. So what is canopy management? So we need to manage our canopy. So canopy management is the manipulation of the tree, and we want to manipulate the tree so that we produce a lot of fruit, because we're not growing leaves and we're not growing shoots for the fun of it. We need to grow fruit, and because we need to make money. So canopy management involves more than just pruning and tree training. It involves understanding what is driving growth of the tree, and it involves a range of techniques to manage flowering and fruit growth and yield and fruit quality and pest management. So we need it's not simplistic. So the aim of canopy management is to help trees harvest more sunshine. That's really what it's all about, because we need sun to drive photosynthesis. We need photosynthesis to produce the carbohydrates that cause the tree to grow, and also to help in flowering, fruit set, and fruit growth. So fruit production involves the capture and conversion of light into fruit biomass, or carbon, those very simple sugars that are produced from the Calvin cycle. And so we need to think about our incoming radiation. We're lucky here in California. We have a very long growing season. In fact, the trees, basically grow from, depending on the winter, from February to October, even into November. We need to think about the percent of the radiation that's intercepted by the tree, and that's going to be influenced by the density of the trees and how overgrown the canopy may be. And we need to think about the conversion of this light energy into fruit. So I'm not sure where Rodrigo took this picture, but this is a California grove. And remember now, these trees, when we look at this, we're looking at the whole tree, we're looking at the canopy, but these canopies are made up of a series of shoots that are either fruiting or non-fruiting. And in this case, you're seeing 2 shoots that have fruit, but they're also being exposed to light. And you can see here the different colors are the different flushes that he measured within a growing season. And so the flushing and the growth, that all bears into the alternate bearing, and it can be modeled by looking at the shoot growth, and the presence of fruit and sunlight exposure is what is driving the whole thing. That's basically it. So by nature, this is a very common sight in California, is you go in and you see these groves, and there is like a park. And I always like this picture on the lower right because it makes me want to bring out a blanket and a book and maybe a glass of wine, and you just relax because you're in a park-like setting, and the fruit is feet and feet above you. You know, as we all know, some of our groves are 20 plus feet tall, and that fruit is up on the top of the tree. It's very difficult to harvest, and you have a lot of infrastructure in your grove that is not productive. So what is the best way to manage light in an avocado grove? And so we're going to step back in time now to a thesis that was done in Israel by Matan Hadari, and he looked at how far does light actually penetrate into an avocado tree that is photosynthetically active. And so this is some data he looked at. This was a hedgerow planting that he went to, and basically we're looking at a cross section of a tree, but where you see the dark lines, that is basically how far light actually penetrated into the tree. Now, if you really want to read more about this master's thesis is on Avocado Source. So basically, the bottom line is, how far does light penetrate into the tree that is photosynthetically active? And what Matan found with his thesis is that the effective light penetration into a Hass avocado tree is only about a half a meter, or about 18 to 20 inches. Okay? So once the light is past that point, it's not going to help you in terms of productivity of the tree. And that also explains why, as you get into the trees, get bigger and bigger, they become these empty shells, because the actual point at which the tree is active photosynthetically is only about 18 inches deep. And this is just another picture. He looked at different planting structures, and what he concluded was that when he went into a high density planting situation where the trees are smaller, you get better light penetration, you actually get better, you get higher amounts of and number of hours in which the tree is active in photosynthesis. That's the bottom line here. So how do we manage the trees? So we're walking around and looking at our groves. We look at this beautiful tree, and it looks like it's productive, but you go inside and there's a lot of non-productive space. And so we need to think about, how do we manage our trees so that they're more efficient? So one way is to prune. And so, you know, here's a picture before and after pruning. And the whole idea here on the pruning is to increase light penetration into the tree. So the key question is, we have a lot of mature groves. How do we renovate large trees and make them more efficient producers? How do we help them harvest light in a more efficient manner? And part of that is understanding tree architecture, and part of that is understanding that the tree is made up of shoots. So tree architecture is what describes the natural growth habit of a tree. Is fundamental to understanding training and pruning of the tree. And the basic architectural tree model for all avocado cultivars is basically the same, but the expression of that model is different. And I'll come back to this at the very end of the talk, okay? So pruning options, and this is some slides that I got from Grant Thorpe. He talks about 6 different methods that you can use for pruning large trees to stimulate them to be more productive. So we'll go through each of these a little bit in detail. So you have the tree thinning approach where you go and just remove trees. You know, it's not an efficient use of your space. And so this is actually a picture. The picture on the right is a picture from New Zealand, and that lift is 10 meters high. So their trees get very, very tall in New Zealand, and it is definitely like a park. And so, you know, as the trees get bigger and bigger, they're more difficult to control. They're more difficult to control for insect pests, definitely more difficult and more expensive to harvest. So another method is, and this is commonly practiced in California, is staghorning and stump pruning. And we can do that, but the trees usually go out of production for 2 to 3 years, and you have to be very careful on how you manage that regrowth. We can treat, if we stump the trees, we do have NAA registered here in California. That will inhibit some of that very rank top growth that occurs and push this lower growth below that, but it's still a problem because it takes time for the trees to come back into production. Now, one thing that Mauricio Tapia and Ruben Hofsche saw at Farm ACW in Duluth many years ago was the idea of coming back, and when you stump the tree, is to come back and graft the sign again. And I know that some people think this is a crazy idea, but it's really, I'm here to tell you that it's really not all that crazy. Because when you properly time that, you can get reliably bloom. If you top work the trees in early spring, you're putting in mature wood into those trees, and you can get return bloom on a very high percentage of the trees the following year. You also, it somehow inhibits all that sucker growth that occurs on the trunk, and it's much easier to manage this regrowth than to let just the trees grow naturally after you stump the trees. And so this is just a comparison. These trees were staghorn top work. You can see in 2010, except that this one was top worked in March. This tree was top worked in May. The tree remained very vegetative and had very poor flowering, whereas this one had you can see that there's fruit on the tree. And this was, the one on the right was comparable to the trees that were just allowed to grow without top working them. So if you're going to do this, you have to buy into the idea that you're going to do it in March and April. The other thing you can do is recycle your branches. Once on the regrowth, here you can see there's fruit. This branch was girdled, and then you can cycle back and forth. So once you harvest here, you remove that branch, and this one is the one that will flower next year, and this branch will send up a sucker below, and that's what actually this is here. So there's ways to manage this to make it work for you. And you need to follow the rule, the 80% rule. Don't let the trees get 80% higher than what your row spacing is. So if you have a 20-foot row spacing, the tree should never be higher than 16 feet. Another way is open vase or donut pruning. Grant Thorpe did a lot of work with this idea in New Zealand. And I've seen it here in California. It doesn't really work very well because it's very difficult to maintain. Pyramid pruning, unfortunately, this is difficult for us to do in California because this is best done with mechanical pruning. They do this in Israel. They do it in New Zealand. I've seen it in South Africa, but they're growing on flat land, and we don't have that luxury for most of our avocado pruning. But the whole idea here is that you're bringing more light into the tree. You could try growing the trees in hedgerows, but then you're limiting the light exposure versus growing the trees as individual trees so that you can maximize light penetration into the tree on all sides. And then you can do the selective limb removal or the windows. And I know a lot of people try having the windows. Again, this is a slide from Grant where they started off with very tall trees and they pruned them down to around 15 feet. And when you think about the window pruning, you have to think about light flux. So I know that people say, well, you know, I open up windows in the tree and I'm getting these light flux. The point is, are light flux effective in terms of helping the tree be productive? And the thing is that the light flux are transitory. They can, a particular branch inside that deep canopy can have light on it from anywhere from maybe 10, 15 minutes, and it'll eventually senesce and drop off to maybe an hour or so. But the work that Bob Heath did showed that it takes about 40 to 50 minutes for the stomates to open up on a leaf that's in the dark with these transient light flux. So you have to wonder, are the light flux really helping the tree? We don't know because this is laboratory data, but it would suggest that you have to have these light going into the canopy for more than just transient amount of time. It needs to be prolonged. So high density planting is an option where you can have individual trees with good light penetration. I know it's practiced in Chile and in other places of the world. Now, what is high density? I tell people it depends on your growing conditions. In Chile, they use plant growth regulators that we don't have access to, so they can grow their trees at a closer spacing. But the idea here is you managing the trees. The lower left panel here is trellising of avocados in South Africa. This is work that's being done by Andre Ernst and his son Xander, where they have they're growing trees on a wire or in a Y. And what you see is that the trellising, because you have better light penetration into the tree canopy, you get better vegetative complexity. Remember, going back, thinking about the shoots, and you have more flushes, you have more laterals, and you have more fruiting shoots. And so again, it highlights this idea that you have to have light penetration into the tree for the tree to be the most productive that it can be. So what is the ideal tree architecture of the future? I don't really know, but I'm excited to tell you that what you see here, these pictures of these trees, are trees from the breeding program that we have of other new varieties. So what should we be looking for in the future? We have Hass, that tends to be a more open spreading tree. But even what we have available now is commercial varieties. We have Lamb Hass, which is pyramidal, and we have Reed that is more cylindrical. And both Lamb Hass and Reed have better light penetration into their tree canopy, and both of them can be more productive than Hass. So the future will be a combination, I believe, of genetics and management. And it's all about managing light for productivity. And this is going back then to, this is the last slide, this is going back to that factory analogy. Here we have light. We have light going onto the leaf. You have reflection and transmission, which are not important in terms of photosynthesis, but light absorption into the leaf gives rise to photosynthesis. The photosynthesis gives rise to an increase in carbohydrates through the Calvin cycle, and that carbon then is partitioned to the different parts, but most importantly, to the final product, which is the fruit. So with that, I'll end. I just want to make sure that you know that this talk is a compilation of a lot of ideas and data from Bob Heath, Mike Mickelbart, Rodrigo Iturrita, Grant Thorpe, Mauricio Tapia, and Ruben Hofschi. And thank you very much. So I see that there's 2 questions. Let's see. One question. No, there's no question. Oh, here we are. Derek Noble, what is the minimum gallons per acre interval to drop temperatures? I think that's a good question, Derek. That goes back more to the evaporative cooling, and I think we have yet to figure that one out, I think. You need to get the leaves wet to some extent so that you can get, that will drive the drop in temperature. So let's see, reclaimed water is cheap. That goes back to the overhead irrigation. 7 days of heat a year requiring misting doesn't sound like a reason to use. Well, that's true. If you have high salt in that water, that salt will stay on the surface of the leaf and it will not be good for the leaf. Here's one. If photosynthesis happens when the leaves are dark green, what can growers do to make, if their trees' leaves are light green or yellow? Especially, you need to apply nitrogen, you need to have potassium. You have to be, to optimize the photosynthetic machinery in the tree, you have to be spot on your nutrition, because the chloroplast, in the middle of the chloroplast, you have magnesium and you have iron. And when the leaves are yellow, it can be due to nitrogen deficiency, but it can also be due to iron deficiency. And the iron and magnesium are crucial to photosynthesis. So you have to be spot on your nutrition. You do need dark green leaves. What can you do? You have to figure out how that you're going to get that nutrition. Mulching helps. Mulching helps. Cover crops, especially a cover crop that can fix nitrogen, can help. I'm sure that Ben has more ideas.
Leaf analysis.
Leaf analysis, right. Oh, what variety you mentioned has less heat stress? We know that lamb has is more tolerant to high heat. I believe Gem is probably more tolerant to high heat. How high is high? I can't tell you that one. When Schwinn was a postdoc with me, we did work with lamb Hass, and we found that where the Hass stomates closed around 90, 95 degree under a low humidity, typical low humidity day of 30% humidity, 25% humidity. The lamb stayed open a little bit longer, but what that threshold is for lamb, I can't tell you. What the threshold is for Gem, I can't tell you. But that is work that needs to be done. But you know what? I'll just be blunt. You guys as growers need to fund that research, because this research is expensive to do. And if you don't fund me, fund someone else to do that kind of research, because that's very crucial information you need so that we know what varieties to grow where, how to manipulate the trees. This information is crucial. And so this information is not just going to drop from the air like rain. You have to generate that information. And with all the cutbacks at the university, it doesn't matter if you're at Cal State or a UC or a private university, there's a lot of cutbacks in research, and you guys need to fund the research. Hurl Rutz. With discussion of global warming, the current density of CO2 is this too high for proper growth, or what would be the right amount for tree production? Don't have that answer. It's a great question, but I don't have the answer. Do you have the answer, Ben? You will reach a point at which the high carbon dioxide will inhibit, but you talk about in greenhouse production, they enhance the carbon dioxide and you get increased productivity. But what the threshold where you actually get past that point, I don't know the answer to that one. Ben, do you?
No, but it would have to be extremely high to be lethal. And Oleg Dalgovich did some work with the raspberries here in tunnels, open tunnels, and injecting CO2, and man, they got so much more production. So, maybe higher CO2 is going to increase yield, but at the consequence of more water use, more high temperatures, and I don't think we need to go that high.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Question from John Connell. Do you think using overhead watering at controlled temperature and humidity makes economic sense based and potential increased productivity? I think You don't want to have it on all the time, because then you're going to put yourself in a situation like Florida and these very humid, rain-fed conditions. And guess what will happen? We'll get a lot more fruit diseases. One of the really nice things about fruit production in California is that we have very low disease pressure in our fruit post-harvest. And if we have high humidity all the time, but I think, telling yourself, if the temperature is going to be 100 plus degrees, I'm going to turn the system on. That makes perfect sense, because one of the problems in the San Joaquin Valley, we have a lot of water, we have a lot of high quality water, we have a lot of light, but we have very high temperature. And what you see up here in the valley is you see very small fruit size. And so think about it. You see the small fruit size because when it gets very hot, the trees are not efficient in photosynthesis. So you're not providing that carbon for the fruit growth. And the trees tend to be more vegetative up here because it's going into that. So yeah, I think it makes economic sense to turn on the overhead watering system to control temperature. At least, try to drop it down around into the upper 80s, low 90s. It's not optimum for photosynthesis of CAS anyway, but you're going to get it down into that area where the tree is going to be making the carbohydrates to fuel fruit growth. Hopefully that answered your question, John. Why doesn't the center branch removal or pruning not help with the light problem? It does on a very temporary basis, but most people don't have the rigor to continue keeping the middle of the tree open. That's basically why it really doesn't work. It works on a temporary basis, but it doesn't work long term. I've seen that in I remember going to South Africa to Holland Sons down in Nelsbrook. They had hectares, acres, where they were doing the center branch removal. And in the end, they abandoned it and cut down the trees and replanted into a higher density and a very rigorous managing the size of the trees. Is stomata conductance affected by boron? Is stomata conductance affected by boron used for fruit sets? I'm not sure I understand that question, Daniel. I don't think so. Ben, do you have some insights into that one?
No, boron's not really affecting.
Boron has been shown to be important in moving perseitol around in the phloem of the tree. Because perseitol is the phloem mobile sugar in the avocado. So but you don't need very much boron to move perseitol around in the tree, and it's very easy to go to boron toxicity, especially here in California. Has UC or other California growers tried trellising in California? I'm not a trellising expert. I've been looking for someone to play around with me on trellising. So if you want to help us, I'm more than willing to work with you. We'd be very happy, and we'd be very happy to try trialing some of our unreleased avocado varieties that are probably are going to be very appropriate for trellising. Now, in South Africa, Maluma is a wonderful variety under at least Andre and Xander's tutelage for trellising. They have fabulous results. They've planted conventional high density and they've done trellising. And even though they have high production with Maluma under high density, they have 30 to 40% higher fruit production in the trellising systems they're doing. But you have to, this isn't for the lighthearted. You have to be very, very committed to managing the trees. So it's it's going to take a different mindset than what we typically think of avocados, of planting them and letting them grow. What factors determine best time for pruning? Now, we like to carry our HAS fruit into the summer. So you don't want to be cutting off the wood that has the fruit on it, but really the best time for pruning is probably in the spring, because the regrowth then can come back and flower for you. If you start pruning after about the middle of May, you'll get vegetative regrowth, but that stuff, that growth will give very few flowers the following year, and then you just compound all this vegetative vigor. So so if you're going to say, I'm going to do some heavy pruning in my orchard, you need to work with your packer and get the fruit off the tree so that you can actually do it at the right time of year. Let's see. Bob Shar, is there an optimum way to start new trees off pruning wise to create a superior producing tree? Grant Thorpe really believes that you need to have a central leader tree. So, not a tree that's heavily branched initially, but a central leader, and then that you manage that central leader tree. We just got funded by this last spring, actually, with the USDA grant, where we've planted a mapping population. And in that mapping population, we're going to look at tree architecture. And part of the tree architecture then is to look at productivity. So it's a multiple year project. So we'll have a better answer in a few years. But right now, the thinking that we have is that you want a tree that tends to be upright with a central leader. You want trees that probably have more flexible wood. Wood flexibility, think of lamb has a sort of a flexible wood, reed is sort of flexible, Hass is not very flexible, and Carmen is not flexible at all. So think about that. So we have a long way to go yet on this. But yeah, I think I like the idea that Grant always had, is start with a central leader and train the tree so that you and keep that tree narrow. You need to keep the tree narrow, because remember that the light that is going to cause for photosynthesis is only penetrating about 20 inches anyway. So why grow a big structure? And that's what really argues for high density, is that you want to keep a tree that's relatively short so we can spray and we can harvest cheaply, and also make that tree as efficient as possible as a factory for us. So when Mauricio Tapia was a manager at Farm ACW, he did a lot of experiments with pruning the trees, and really it was keeping tall, slender trees, letting the light penetrate, and when they didn't take care of the trees and just let them grow, that's when they would get out of their way. Excuse me, I just need to turn this off. When does a summer flush start so we can target fertilizer for pushing growth? Well, it depends, Derek, that's a great question. It depends on the year, of course, but generally now is when the summer flush starts, the end of July, beginning of August, and it goes usually until the beginning to middle of October. And that's when you really, most of the tree, that's what we learned from the phenology project by tagging a lot of branches and following them growing. And Rodrigo did that as part of his PhD. And basically, by the time you get into middle of October, you're not seeing a lot of growth. So that the tree is sort of slowing down, and then it starts to put all that energy into flowering for the following spring. Do you think that avocados' use of 7-carbon sugars has something to do with their high production of lipids? Fantastic question, Sean, that we don't have the answer to. We know, we looked at the changes in the carbohydrates in the developing fruit, and indeed, what you see is that the main sugar in the fruit is perseitol and mannahapsulose. And in the fall, late August, early fall, is when the fruit on Hass begins to accumulate measurable oil. And as that oil begins to accumulate in the fruit, you see a drop off of all sugars, and in particular, persitol and mannose. So in that sense, they're providing most likely the substrate for oil production. But how they're metabolized from the fruit, I can't tell you. We don't know that answer. That is part of, actually, a part of Eric Folk's PhD thesis, where he's looking at oil accumulation in HAS and some HAS mutants, the two, Flavia and Eugen, from Chile, that are believed to be earlier maturing HAS-like fruit. So he has some interesting data. There's some differences in the oil content of the fruit and the oil composition, but we don't really know. We don't have that answer right now. Great question, though. What was the rule of thumb? 80%. It's the 80% rule. So if let's say your rows are spaced at 20 feet, then the maximum height of the tree you want is about 16 feet, 80% of 20. Seems that inland growers get production deeper into the canopies compared to coastal growers. I'm reading this. I'm trying to digest this one. Seems that inland growers get production deeper into the canopies compared to coastal growers. I'm in Ramona. My trees generally bloom an arm's length into the canopies. Maybe different locations need to use slightly different I would agree with you that, one rule doesn't fit all. You need to take the principles and then adapt the principles to your situation. It could be that you have better light penetration because you have less light. We have less cloud cover inland than we do along the coast. That could be part of it. But generally, the cooler climates along the coast, you tend to get a little bit higher overall productivity. So it's a balancing act because you have higher temperature, more water stress potentially inland than you have along the coast. Unfortunately, we don't have too much coastal avocados anymore. It's all houses, especially in San Diego County. The coastal climate is a little bit friendlier for flowering and fruit set because you can actually get overlap with the male and female stages a little bit more within the tree in a more cooler, more humid conditions. Are there better times to prune in the year? Most wait till they pick. That's right. So you have to balance that. So, you don't have to do a heavy pruning every year, or like on the hedgerowing that they do with the machine pruning, a lot of people, they prune alternate sides of the tree. So one year they'll prune one side of the tree and let the other side of the tree grow. And then the following year they prune that side after harvest and they let that prune side grow. So that's another way of alternating sides within the tree. It's similar to that idea of girdling and removing the girdle branch after it flowers and letting the other branch that's non-girdled be the main branch the following year. So you're cycling branches. And so you have better light penetration into those branches, those tall scaffolds. Hopefully that answers your question, Jane. Is there any recommended new orchard planting orientation to maximize light interception? Great question. In Southern California, where the terrain and we have hillsides and everything, that's very, very difficult because you have to plant, the question is, do you plant along the contour or do you plant up and down? And I used to be a contour planting advocate, but after going to Chile and seeing those rows go up and down the rows, it could be that's, do you have an opinion on that, Ben? I don't really have an opinion.
The question is, what is optimization for light interception? And traditionally, if you're on flat ground with no hills, it was a north-south planting orientation. Yeah. Well, that's not an option. If you're looking for optimum erosion control, it's on the contour. But if you're looking at optimum, efficiency of machine work and so on, it's up and down the slope. So it's if you're in San Diego where it never rains, then up and down the slope works. If you're in a more northern climate where more rainfall, and when we get 50 inches of rainfall in Ventura, if you're up and down a slope, you're gonna have a disaster, I think. So it's the sort of thing goes back to what you were saying of everything is contextual. So if you're on the coast, you do it one way. If you're inland, you might do it another way. You've got one variety. So there's a lot of different options available, and a grower needs to explore all of those. So there's no one set answer. I grew up working with soils, and we were always told, never disturb the soil surface. And so if you're doing up and down machine work, you're disturbing the soil surface.
Yeah.
Contours are the way to go.
Okay, on a smaller tree, is it helpful to tree productivity to remove interior growth that's more than 20 inches into the canopy? I wouldn't say so. The tree self-prunes itself. I mean, go into a big tree, you see a lot of dead wood, and that dead wood eventually falls off. Now, if you look at the work that you guys are funding on Botrysphaeria, there's a high level. The Botrysphaeria is living on all that dead wood. Anthracnose lives on all that dead wood, and so a certain amount of cleaning up the interior of the tree once in a while probably is a good idea, just from a fruit pathogen and management. But I think on a smaller tree, if I'm thinking a small tree, 10 feet tall, not very wide, it can't hurt to do it once in a while, but you don't have to be doing it all the time. That would be my answer. Derek Noble. In limb removal, can the interior lower canopy leaves that have filtered light become fruitful when exposed to a full dose of light as the tree is reduced? Yes, it can be. They can be, because they're there. They have the machinery already there but there are differences between shade and sun leaves. The leaves that were developed in the shade tend to be much thinner. They have less epicuticular wax. They may have less stomates than the sun leaf. So that's well known in literature on other fruit crops and plants. And there's been a limited amount of work. Alejandro Barrientos did a small project actually here in California. We went and collected shade leaves and sun leaves, and he went back down. He took the leaves back down to Mexico after they were fixed, and looked at them, and there were big differences in that palisade layer. So remember, on the cross section of the leaf, you have the boundary layer. I mean the palisade layer. Then you have the parenchyma, the spongy mesophyll layer, where the carbon dioxide comes in. Well, in the shade leaf, that amount of open space is different than in the sun leaf, but they're adaptable to a certain sense. So yes, you can expect. So that was a long-winded answer to you, Derek. Sorry. Is there a best time for girdling? A lot of work's been done on girdling in Israel. We did some work here on girdling many years ago, and in the fall. If you really want to promote a little bit more flowering, you need to do it in the fall. Now, how big of a girdle? That's a controversial topic, and I think you could talk to a bunch of people that do girdling. Some people do a wide girdle, some people do a narrow girdle, some people do a spiral girdle. You have to play around with it and decide what works for you. But if you do it in the fall, then there's a couple outcomes. A lot of times if you girdle in the fall, especially if it's a bigger girdle, you'll push that replacement shoot below the girdle, so that when you go and you remove that girdle branch in a year and a half, you actually have a replacement branch already waiting for you. So that's one advantage of doing it in the fall. Regarding the 80% rule for 20-foot spacing, should they be pruned at 16 foot high? Should they be pruned to, say, 14 feet and allowed to grow? I would do the latter. Take them down a little bit, and then they're going to grow. If you're always topping them, you're going to get sort of that witch's broom eventually. And so you need to manage the witches, that if you're always cutting them at the same point, you might cut some branches a little bit higher and others a little bit lower and play around with that over the years. Jan Terrain long ago wrote that the spring flush is just vegetative and might as well be pruned off if you're trying to keep the canopy down in size. Oh, that's interesting. Jan Terrain was very, very observant individual. In some ways, I don't agree with it because the spring flush, this fall, so this is the spring flush here. The fall flush comes off of the spring flush. So if you cut it off, you're cutting off the potential for the summer flush. If you cut it off, then the tree has to regenerate lateral buds. So I think the more important thing is you don't want a super vegetative spring flush because that's competing with the fruit, and fruit set in early fruit growth. And so that's where you need to balance things out. And that's where you have to have a balanced tree going into bloom. Ben, I know you have a comment.
Yeah, Carol Levitt and from Mexico showed that that spring flush hardens off and matures to set the flower buds in late summer, fall too. And so if you're pruning that off, you're going to be removing the
potential. But most of the flowers are born on that summer flush, actually.
Yeah.
So, but you need the spring flush to promote the summer flush.
Yeah, right.
Again, it's very, very complicated. If you have an extremely vegetative tree in the spring, it might pay to do some selective pruning. If you see that the tree is so vegetative and you're having excessive fruit drop, then maybe you might want to go in and do some tipping of the branches. If you have the opposite, you have these indeterminate and determinate shoots. So when you have an indeterminate shoot, the shoot keeps growing and the fruit are born back here. In a determinate shoot, the shoot basically ends with the inflorescence, and then those poor fruit are out in the open, and you have to push a lateral from behind to shade the fruit and protect it from the sun. So it really depends on the tree, depends on the spring, but I think you have to think about a little bit more about what I would definitely not go and cut off all the spring flush for sure. But it competes with the fruit, so you have to keep it in check. Let's see. When is the best time to start pruning newly planted trees? Mainly talking about the low branches that will get in the way later on as they get bigger. Well, you need to be training the trees from the time you plant them. You want to have them do what you want them to do. It depends on the structure of the tree that you get from the nursery. I mean, if your goal is to have an upright, slender, upright tree, then you want to have a strong central leader. You might tip back. If you have a tree that has multiple main branches from the nursery, you might want to tip. You need to pick the one that you want to be the central leader, and then tip the other ones. But now, I'll tell you what we noticed with a very high heat event from a couple years ago when we first planted the rootstock trial, both at Santa Paula and down in Bonzo. That high heat killed those shoot tips. The trees had only been in the ground for a little bit over a year, and then they got hit by that heat. And the main shoot, those trees, a lot of them were nice central leader trees. The growing point was snapped off by the heat, and then we've had a lot of lateral branches, and we have multiple leaders now in the tree, especially in Santa Paula. If you go and look at the structure of the tree, so environmental stress can make it even more challenging to train those trees. That's what I've learned. Any kind of stress, actually, because I think down in Bonsall, it's more of the salinity and high root rot. The trees are a little bit stressed, and again, they're a lot of the main axis has died, and they're highly branched. I know that's not a great answer, but that's the answer I comes to my mind. Jonathan Dixon used to advocate for December, January tip pruning to promote more actual fruit saw. I wouldn't do that because the flowers are born at the tips of the shoots primarily.
Yeah.
When you start tipping those shoots, you're most of the flowers. So Rodrigo did a really nice job of mapping where the flowers are in his PhD thesis, and you get some flowers back on that spring flush from the previous year, but most of the flowers are born on the summer flush, and the more complex inflorescences are closer to the shoot tip. And the inflorescences become more and more simple as you move back the branch. And it probably has to do with the movement of the flowering hormone FT, because it goes to the point of most active cell division. That's part of the answer, probably. So are you thinking that maybe Jonathan Dixon was talking December, January, but he meant New Zealand because that would be summer? And then maybe that would be because that would be promoting more complexity in the shoot.
There's also, too, if you're getting a lot of sucker growth, suckers tend to grow straight up and they don't flower. And if you head those back and forth laterals, they tend to flower then. So that's not tipping per se, that's forcing laterals.
But in Riverside, Ben, on those water shoots, the very strong water shoots, we saw a lot of flowering in the spring on those water shoots, and they're very complex because they come up. There's a lot of it, they have very good light penetration, and at least in Riverside, maybe it's the weather on Riverside, they had a lot of flowering and very early flowering in the spring. So I think the idea of the water, I know the guy that came from South Africa, can't remember. The guy with the pruning guy, can't remember his name. Anyway, he promoted taking out the water shoots. I'm not 100% convinced that the water shoots need to come out. They need to be managed maybe in a different way, but do they need to come out? I'm not sure, because they're actually the tree restructuring itself. I don't see any more questions. And we've gone way after 11.
Yep.
But
well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for all the great questions. These were really tough questions. They're thought-provoking questions. It's really great to see that you guys are really thinking about things. So that's very much appreciated.
So Leah Boyd's been monitoring this. She's with the Avocado Society, and this will be posted on the Avocado Society website next week sometime. Salson has cleaned it up, and can all review it again. Well,
thank you very much.
Have a good day.
Same, and everybody stay safe and cool out there.